Hey everybody. So I'm Perry Radford, Deputy Director of New Mexico Open Elections. I just want to say thank you so much for coming to our town hall today. This is our Strengthening Democracy Town Hall. This is in our series dedicated to sharing information and educating New Mexicans about important issues and policies related to election reform and good government. This year, our state legislature was very busy with a lot of things, but they were especially busy with bills on these topics. So we thought it would be a great opportunity today to bring some folks who were involved in this legislative session um, to come and talk about it and share more with the public and let you know what's been going on and what changes we're going to be seeing. So before I introduce our panelists, I just please stay muted for the duration of today's panel. We're holding about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A. So if you can hold your questions till then or put them in the chat, we will come back to you at the end of the session. So I want to just start off introducing everybody here today. So, first of all, we have Sila Avcil, who you probably already know, our Executive Director of New Mexico Open Elections. We're also joined by State Representative Rubio. Thank you so much for being here. We're joined by our friend and partner, Molly Swank, Executive Director of Common Cause New Mexico. And unfortunately, due to an illness, Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver is not able to join us today. We wish her a speedy recovery, but we're in such good hands because instead we have Lindsey Bachman joining us. Lindsey is the Director of Legislative and Executive Affairs for the Secretary of State, and like all the panelists today, deeply involved on these issues in this session. Uh, so with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Scylla to kind of start us off with an overview and get us situated in some context for today. So can you tell us a little bit about the democracy reform priorities for New Mexico open elections, our coalition partners? What was going on this legislative session? What were the bills and policies that were up for debate?
Yeah, thanks, Perry. And first of all, thank you all for being here tonight with us on this cloudy Tuesday evening, depending on where you're at, whether you're in Albuquerque or in other places around the country. So thank you for joining us. This legislative session that started in January and ended in March, we had a few priorities, and some of our partners had a few other democracy and elections related priorities. As New Mexico Open Elections and NM Voters First, our number one top priority was the semi-open primaries bill. It was Senate Bill 16, sponsored by Representative Angelica Rubio. Thank you for being with us today. Representative Kathleen Cates, Representative Christina Parajon, and Senator Figueroa and Senator Peter Worth. We started it in the Senate, made it all the way through this year. It was recently signed by the governor and is now the law of the land, which we'll get more into later this evening. But aside from that, we also had a few other priorities. We were supporting Molly and the Common Cause team on getting a constitutional amendment for the creation of an independent salary commission because our state is the only state that does not salary their legislators. They only get a per diem. It's very small. It's not accessible to run for office and be in office in the state. And Representative Rubio also sponsored that bill, so she'll talk a little more about that as well. And then there were a few other key election bills sponsored by other representatives and senators that the Secretary of State's office was supporting, such as election and Secretary of State funding, and as well as the lobbying reform and campaign reform bills that Molly can get into here in a little bit as well. But just wanted to let you guys know before we get in the very weeds of everything, these are the bills that we were all interested in and supporting, and the bills that we will talk about this evening. So thank you.
Great. So I want to start off with a question for Representative Rubio, which is more of a question about our audience and stakeholders, voters, constituents. So leading up to the session and during the session, how how were constituents involved? How did your work, was it shaped by, hearing from people in your district or hearing from people who care about issues that you work on? How did that input shape your experiences this session?
Thanks, Perry, and thanks everyone. Good to see a lot of you all. You know, I was elected in 2016, and my first session was in 2017, and this was my eighth session, and I feel that a lot of the legislation that I put forth generally comes from community. I don't know if that's necessarily the process that other legislators take, but for me, that's something that I definitely take into consideration is working with coalition partners, working with folks who I represent and others who care about good governance that any type of legislation that is introduced, especially this year when we're talking about the bills that Sila just shared. I also carried a lot of legislation to address the housing crisis here in New Mexico. And so a lot of the bills that we introduce, we definitely, at least in my case, do a lot of consulting with folks in the community and how it's going to impact them directly.
Great. And just as a follow-up, this is the first session where legislative aids were in play as well. Can you share any about how that shaped the legislative session for legislators like yourself and connecting the public with their elected officials?
Yeah, so just for context, we not I guess it was the last budget session. We passed in our budget a line item to allow for legislators to finally have staff. And so that's something that's never existed. And so but also it's still rolling out because not everyone was allowed to hire staff prior to session. There was only a few of us who were lucky enough to be supported up in Santa Fe, but also have our staff back home in our own districts. And so for me personally, I did have an opportunity to have a staff person on hand in Santa Fe, which is generally something that's provided, but they're not up to speed on the work that we're doing back home. It's mostly helping us with supporting, answering calls, taking messages, going and picking up like copies and things like that. A lot of like the logistical day to day things that we need done in Santa Fe. But now, for me, not only did I have that support up there, but I also had support down south through the legislative assistant that I have here in Las Cruces. And so I think for me, it was really important because, especially when we talk about capital outlay and all the funding that is allocated to us per the budget, it was really important for me to have my legislative assistant to be able to talk to them in real time and if I had questions about certain items around not only just capital outlay but other issues related to legislation, that there was an additional person that I could reach, that I could speak to, who could work on my behalf. And I think as things start to roll out, I know that there's a lot of legislators already working to finalize their hiring of their legislative staff in their districts. That's going to make, in my opinion, an incredible, I think, change to how we operate as a legislature. I know that it's something that many legislators actually needed and wanted. If you were to look at the issue around salaries versus staff was a priority for legislators. Many legislators feel like if we're not going to get a salary, then having a staff person would be the next ideal thing.
Thank you. And we'll talk a little bit about salaries later on, but I think this is just a big unheralded step that maybe not everyone realized was a big step forward for us in terms of modernization this section. Well, great. Well, let's talk about SB 16 and opening our primaries. So if y'all haven't heard the news, I'm guessing if you're on this call, you probably have. New Mexicans are finally going to have open primaries starting next year in 2026. However, a lot of footwork is already going on behind the scenes to make that happen. So I'd love to, hear from this different group. All of you are so involved in making this happen, and some of you are going to be even more involved with actually bringing it to fruition. So, Scylla, you've been working on this issue for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about why this issue was so important now, and what it took to make it through this legislative session and get signed into law?
Absolutely. So this was the 10th time this bill was introduced, meaning that before most of us were involved in this issue, there were 7 whole years of effort put into introducing bills, getting sponsors, getting volunteers to join New Mexico open elections. And I joined the organization 3 years ago. And so in total, we have been working for 10 years since the founding of NMOE to get some form of primary reform passed. And in the last 60-day session in 2023, our state legislature passed the Voting Rights Act, which encapsulated automatic voter registration. And so we knew that once that was being fully implemented, we would see an increase of registered voters in the state of New Mexico that would be registered independent. We already have an increase in registration of people registering as independent in our state, but this law would make that number even more drastic than it already is, because when you're automatically registering voters, you can't force them into parties. They have to personally choose a party. And so when you're at the DMV, you're trying to renew your voter or your driver's license, you're more likely there just to get in and out, and you don't want to fill out like all the documents or click all the buttons in front of you. So you're more likely to just skip the option of picking a party, or wherever else you are where this process is being implemented, you're again more likely to just pass. And so we expected this already to happen. And so this year, we built a huge coalition of about 22 organizations, and I see some members here. So thank you all for being here today. I'm not going to mention all the names of the coalition partners, but we had great, diverse members all across the state. We had Common Cause, NM Native Vote, we have Cafe, NM Cafe here, and NM Asian Family Center, and Young Democrats. And so it was really interesting to build such a great coalition and work on this, because this issue mattered for everybody involved for different reasons and for similar reasons. But we were very excited to have great sponsors like Senator Worth and Representative Rubio to help us get through the session, because it was definitely, like everyone can relate to, it was a hectic session for sure. And a lot of good things didn't pass, but this was probably my favorite thing that passed, and I know a lot of people can relate to that as well. So this was the time, and I'm really glad that we were able to do it together.
Great. Molly, Representative Rubio, and Lindsey, you were all there working the whole session on this as well. What can you share about uh, how the session went and how we advanced this bill and, what that process was like?
Sure, I'll jump in. Hi, everybody. I'm Molly Swank with Common Cause New Mexico. Um, I was really excited about this bill because I was part of the fight for the New Mexico Voting Rights Act a couple of years ago. And like Scylla had mentioned, we knew that we would see increased registrations for declined to state and independent voters because of that bill. But also, I think it's really important to look at some of the other demographics. So Scylla has all of this information stored away in her brain, but I know that we're seeing more and more decline to state voters in young voters. They are becoming more and more not disenfranchised, jaded by the two major parties. So I think that was a really big piece of the conversation this year, was the fact that young voters are predominantly declined to state. I know that there are other demographics like for voters and for the Native communities too are predominantly declined to state and independent voters. Is that right, Sila?
Yes, so 40% of registered Indigenous voters under the age of 35, 40% of them are registered DTS independent.
Nothing officially out of the Sun for today.
And just to add to that, we also see nationally 49% of our veterans registering as independent too. So we had a huge participation in every single committee hearing from the veterans groups that we were partnering with, and they were, sending letters and emails to their legislators, making sure that they know that this was a big issue for the veteran community in New Mexico as well. So the diversity of demographics, Molly, absolutely. It was a huge contributing factor to why we needed to get this done this year.
Yeah, and I think along with that, so this bill just made sense to Common Cause, and we signed on as quickly as we possibly could to be a partner on the bill. Um, our organization wants to make sure that anybody who wants to vote and can do so without barriers. And so this bill really helps lift some of those barriers for declined to state voters. So I know that some of the opposition that we heard is that declined to state and independent voters can already vote. They just have to change their registration. But that in itself is a barrier to voting. So we're stoked that this passed. Making sure that folks who are registering to vote are then welcomed into our election systems is a really big step forward for New Mexico, I think.
Yeah, and I think, hey everyone, Lindsey Bachman, I'm with the Secretary of State's office. Again, Secretary expressed dismay at not being able to attend and chat with all of us tonight. I know that you join me in sending her well wishes as she heals. I just wanted to kind of piggyback off of what Molly and Zilla have shared. From the perspective of the secretary, this has long since been something that she has wanted to see accomplished, this specific form of semi-open primary where folks have the opportunity who have chosen not to affiliate with a party to go in and elect to participate in the primary election. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First, we all know that there are contests that occur in the primary that are determinative, that are going to be the person that wins because there's not a general election opponent. So that's the first reason. And there's such a large portion of the voter population that are choosing not to affiliate with one of the major parties. So that's the first sort of reason why there's been so much support from this bill from the office. And then the secondary item is that we see and we know through other methods with young voters, if they can be pre-registered, for example, if they can participate in a primary election, they're more likely to participate in a general. So we know that voter participation really hinges on that actual participation. It begets more participation over time. And so it's really an exciting time for New Mexico to kind of see how this will play out and impact turnout, hopefully in a positive trajectory. I did want to mention it is interesting. It will be interesting to see how the bill's effective date of July 1 of this year plays out in coordination with automatic voter registration, which has been raised a couple of times on this call, and I don't want to derail us too much, but that also goes into effect on July 1st, 2025. And what that means is that when you go to your NVD and you update your license, you apply for a license, some permitting, you will be put through a voter registration process if you meet eligibility requirements at the point of the transaction with MVD. And so what that means is we're going to be seeing a lot of folks who engage with the voting process for the first time. And that's really, really exciting. It also means that, once they get to the primary election. So let's say I go to the MVD between now and November. My first election that I can vote in is actually this November. We vote every November in New Mexico for local elections. But then the one that will probably be elevated in comms and all of those things that voters see is the primary election. And what I know as a former administrator at the county level is folks would arrive at the primary hoping to vote and wouldn't have the opportunity to do so. And now, if you're a declined to state voter, you can without changing your party affiliation. And if you're a minor party voter, you will be offered the opportunity to change your voter registration at the polling location. So I just kind of wanted to share those little tidbits before we get too far down the road.
It sounds like a lot of opportunities to build voter engagement, voter trust, voter participation, and maybe see a reversal of some of the trends we've seen around voting. So, Lindsey, I'd love to just follow up and ask you to share more about what the implementation of open primaries is going to look like. You know, both your work in the Secretary of State's office, of course, the work of our clerks is going to be impacted by this change. And I understand work is already happening towards this, even though we're over a year away from it rolling out from the first time. So tell us what this process is going to look like to make it happen for you and what we can expect to see.
Sure. So it's I'm not saying it's super boring, but there are a number of very techy things that will have to take place in terms of the systems that we currently have. We know that the vendors that we work with have experience with implementing some version of open primaries, and so we feel confident about that process. What voters will likely see prior to a primary election, prior to next year's primary, is changes to forms, right? Information on our website will change, language related to who can participate in a primary, et cetera. The way you apply for an absentee ballot. So folks we have more than 50,000 New Mexicans who are on the permanent absentee list, which was part of that voting rights bill that passed in 2023, which is great. I am one of those voters. And so I will be given the opportunity, or actually I will not, because I'm registered with a major party. But if you are not, we're going to do some outreach to those voters and let them know how to update so that they can get a ballot for the primary election next year. So it'll be things like that. The experience at the polling location will likely be the same experience that voters have now, although if you are a DTS, there'll likely be an additional step or two in the way you communicate what ballot you want at the polling location. And then, we work very closely with the 33 county clerks across the state. We have regular meetings with them on new initiatives of the office and of recently passed legislation. And so we'll engage with them. There will likely be some rulemaking that has to take place to kind of talk through what canvassing looks like. Canvassing is an election word for basically reconciliation post-election. It's like built-in auditing. And New Mexico does a great job of those audits. We have several in place following each election. So there will be that type of work, some formal, a lot of it behind the scenes. We have a great team at the Secretary of State's office that's already hit the ground running and has a plan to ensure that both AVR and semi-open primaries launch successfully and timely.
Great. Well, I'm going to pivot the conversation right now to talk a little bit about legislative modernization. So this session, in terms of modernization, a big focus was getting our legislature paid. As you may or may not know, last unpaid legislature in the country. So Representative Rubio, can you tell us a little bit about your experience and the experience of your peers and why we need a paid legislature?
Yeah, thanks, Perry. And I know that there was some stuff going on in the chat. Just for folks to understand, this issue has gone to voters 6 different times, and voters have rejected it 6 different times. And so I think prior to my joining the legislature in 2017, folks just kind of stopped working on it. I know that there was a legislator from Doñana County previous to me joining the legislature, where they also tried, and it just never really made it anywhere. And I've been really appreciative of the coalition work that's been happening around this issue for the last few years, because I think we really have gone in, especially in the last. I think the 2019 was the year that we made it the closest to actually getting something passed in the House and the Senate, and ultimately, I think the reason that we haven't had anything really we haven't really had anything go to the voters for to consider is because I think there's just a lack of political will within our legislature. There are legislators who don't feel like we need to get paid. There's something noble about doing this as a volunteer, being proud of being called a citizen legislator. There's also a lot of money involved in there's a lot of wealth in our legislature, and I think that getting a salary would prevent legislators from continuing to have the kind of wealth that they currently have. And then also it just opens it up to people who don't necessarily have access to do this. And so I think there's a lot. I feel like we're reaching a point where it will break. I feel like we're getting more and more closer to getting a salary. But I think just even having a debate, especially in the Senate, has been really, really challenging. The House is very much supportive of the constitutional amendment that we have introduced in the past. The constitutional amendment is essentially to create a commission to establish salaries and to essentially adjust what those salaries would be in the future. And it would just require voters to support that. And the fact that we can't even get it out of the Senate is very, I think, political. And I think eventually we'll get there. But I think we have all been really sort of debriefing and discussing other options. Should we include term limits in that conversation? And I think there's a lot of openness to that, especially because as a trifecta where we can't get this piece of legislation passed with the Democratic led chambers, both chambers, and a governor, that if that perhaps this is something that we need to really rework and really look at terming legislators and ensuring that we get this through.
Thank you, Representative. So Molly, you and Common Cause were really important leaders on this issue and the coalition that was working towards it. Can you tell us a little bit about the coalition strategy, the partners that were involved, and, what led us to the strategy that we implemented this time around?
Sure. Thanks, Perry. And thank you for that background, Representative Rubio. So Common Cause has been working on legislative modernization for a handful of years. And I think the fact that you mentioned, Representative, that the voters had seen this type of ballot initiative in the past and kept voting it down really pointed to our coalition that we need to increase community education and really meet people where they are. So Common Cause I think over 6 or 7 years, we have been doing some community polling and research. We've been doing focus groups about this issue just to get a baseline of where voters are in their understanding of our legislature and how it works. And one thing that we're finding is that people are actually really supportive of this. So when community members find out that our legislature is unpaid, they're shocked. There's this magic number that community members have. They think that legislators are paid $75,000. That came up in multiple polls, in multiple surveys, and we're not really sure where that came from. So when people find out that that's not true, there's another level of education that we get to do in that point. And so we have been working to build up the coalition around the legislative salaries for a handful of years. Sila mentioned some of the partners that are in the room. And we've been focusing on community education and making sure that our support bases know that our legislature is unpaid, and why it's so important. And one of the main reasons that we talk about the importance of a paid legislature is equal representation and equity within our roundhouse. A lot of our representatives, our Common Cause's talking point around this is that you have to be one of the three R's to run for office. You have to be rich, retired, or extremely resourceful to subsidize your own time in the legislature. And we just don't think that's not how New Mexico works. That's not how our communities work. That's not how the majority of the folks in our communities across the state look. That's not how they function. And so we really want to see more people running for office to have a more representative legislature, making decisions for our communities. So we've been doing a lot of community education. We've been working really closely with the sponsors like Representative Rubio to figure out the best way to come at this. And the Independent Salary Commission is where we have landed now. But with all of the politics that happen within the roundhouse, we may have to shift our tactics. So like Representative said, looking at things like term limits, adding language around maybe there's an opt out for those folks that say they don't want a salary. Maybe that's the way to get them over the hump, is to say, well, you don't have to take it. You can opt out of it. Maybe trying to figure out more detailed language about the guardrails around the salaries. So do we want to look at the median household income for New Mexico as a state, and that is the cap for our legislators? Do we want to look at federal numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics? And so that's where we're at with our coalition partners now, is trying to think about changing our tactics, changing the language to make it more inclusive and more relatable for legislators. I think that we have been our coalition is about 20 organizations at this point. We continually we want to reach out. This is a nonpartisan issue, so we're trying to reach out to organizations that represent, all ideologies, all ends of the political spectrum. But there's always room for growth and improvement. And so that's what Common Cause is going to be working on in the coming months and leading up to the next sessions, is trying to grow our coalition and just reach more people to talk about this important issue.
Great. Well, thank you both for sharing kind of what went down and what we're thinking will happen in the future, how we need to pivot. Speaking of which, let's take a little bit of time to talk about these kind of meta bills that affect how our elections are funded, how local elections are run. So, Lindsey, I want to turn it over to you and hear a little bit about, some of these more administrative bills that the public may not hear as much about, that affect the day-to-day operations around our elections. Can you share what happened with those this session?
Sure. So I think it's maybe not as well known to the public how many bills impact our office, that are introduced each legislative session. I think we gave feedback through the FIR process, the fiscal impact report, that's sort of an agency analysis outlet in the Roundhouse. And I think we did around 54 of those this time. And then we monitored as bills moved, around 36 of those throughout the legislative session. So there was quite a lot of action, as I say. There were a few that we were prioritizing. The first, obviously, we were incredibly supportive of SB 16, but we also had an administrative cleanup bill, a bill that, again, may not be as dramatic or super drawing for journalists, etc., all those things. It didn't have a lot of pizzazz, but it did have some really meaty things for election administrators and was really rooted in the realities of the work that those administrators do. That bill it made it through one committee and stalled in the Senate. The components in it are still critical components, and I would not be surprised if they come back again in a future legislative session. And they addressed things like, what happens when there's a natural disaster and election sites need to be moved, or what if it needs to go to an all-male election in a county because, they don't have the facilities they need to run the election. Back in when I first started in election administration, I went to a conference and I heard this man who had to run an election in New Orleans 6 months after Katrina. So when he was talking about it, right, like they literally stood up tents. It was like full on, all hands on deck, go get every extension cord at Harbor Freight or whatever, right? Like they were doing what they had to do to run the election. And so there's some work we might do around rulemaking in those spaces since the bill did not pass. So hopefully it'll be something that comes back in the future, but in the interim, we'll use our administrative authority to kind of outline some things. So there's that. The second bill that we were very supportive of, and we work closely with Molly on a number of things when we're in legislative session, and that was a campaign finance bill. That bill had shown up first in 2023. It passed the Senate, passed all of its House committees, and it died on the House floor. This year, it was the same version of the bill. It had items in it from our office to improve the administration of campaign finance. And then it had some items from the State Ethics Commission and some items that Common Cause had identified. We did make it through the Senate without a single no vote. It was scheduled late for a committee and the tail end of the legislative session on the House side. And it was not heard ultimately in that committee. So that one, I would imagine there'll be different variations of those fixes. They are still super important for transparency of funds, particularly around PACs and independent expenditures. And New Mexicans, back to your earlier comment, Perry, about confidence in government, what we know is that what we see and what we hear is that folks are having a hard time with that confidence and trust in government. So transparency bills and bills that support the way candidates show where their money is coming from and how they're utilizing it are really, really important. So there was that one. And then really quickly, I did want to touch on, I know I can get down a rabbit hole, so stop me, Perry, if I go too far. But the final thing that really became and continues to be a point for us as an office is our funding. And what you'll hear the secretary say in committee and what is true is that our office continually goes to the legislature and asks for funding and we engage in that budgeting process. What we had tried to do in 2024 is stabilize the way elections were funded specifically, because if you can imagine, it's a pretty expensive year in our even numbered year. In our odd numbered year, we have one election, and in the even numbered year, we had two. So our budgets would fluctuate so much. It was confusing for folks. And so we streamlined that, and all elections are funded out of the election fund on a reimbursement process. We still have some work to do on our operating side of things. And this year, we're really looking down the barrel of some loss of resources that were free through CISA, which is a cyber infrastructure security agency. Don't quote me for sure on the acronym, but CISA does a lot of important work around the security of our elections and gave a lot of free services to counties, rural counties that don't have IT departments, for example, and then some technology upgrades that would be really expensive for us to take on. And that agency has not been exempt from some of the changes going on with federal funding and federal personnel. And so we have concerns as we continue to kind of navigate the federal environment. Our HAVA funds we know will be significantly less. So it's something that should be top of mind for us all. We're number one in the country for election administration, and that's due to the foresight investment of the legislature in the way that they have passed great policies that make our elections secure and accessible. And we have to continue to support those policies on the budgeting side in order to maintain that level of ranking across the country. So with that, I know that was a lot, but like I said, there were 54 and I really just touched on 4. So I think I did pretty good.
Well, thank you for that update and getting us through the high points on it. So we're getting closer to the end of our call, and so I'm gonna make one last pivot here. Now, before I do that, there's one person came in that we want to acknowledge, which is Secretary Senator Figueroa, who's one of our amazing sponsors and advocates of SB 16 throughout this process. So we really just want to give her a special thank you, acknowledgement for all of her work and leadership to make this happen. So with that, I'm going to open a Q&A. There are a few issues, of course, we didn't talk about. All those bills Lindsey referred to, the lobbying disclosures. If folks could please use the raise your hand reaction, or put your question in the chat, or slowly come off mute. We'd love to hear your questions.
Perry, if it's okay while folks are typing, or is it okay if I fill a silence? Oh
Well,
no, there's Diane. Go ahead.
Diane just raised her hand, so
Yeah, go ahead.
let's hear
Hi,
it, Diane.
everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Diane Cox. I'm a ward chair for the Democratic Party, political consultant. I am always have been for semi-open elections. And I can't tell you how excited we are, especially after these past elections. I live in an area that is red purple, right? I'm trying to build. I moved here trying to build. And so I've been talking to a lot of people, kind of getting a feel for where they stand. I'll be doing all my tracking starting this weekend. But I've talked to so many people, including members of Indivisible, that's progressive, who after these elections and after basically what happened, they've left our party. I do know Republicans also who've left their party because of and so my goal is to really pull in independent voters and educate them on the importance of this. So anything I can do, I don't know if I should email Common Cause, any way I can help, because I'm going to be finding out from my Democratic Party Bernalillo County Chair if that's okay for me to do, number one. But I just want to thank you all. I've done a lot of legislative liaison work. I've done a lot of testimony, both in the House and the Senate. And I want to really thank you guys for everything you've done. I mean, this is a big thing for our state. And I'm all for also a paid legislature. So anything I can do about that. Thank you. This is wonderful. I'm done.
Yeah, I think what Diane touched on is super important, like just making sure that everybody across the state knows about semi-open primaries. So Sila and I, we have meetings set up in the next few weeks to start talking about how to roll out some deeper community education in partnership with the county clerks, in partnership with the Secretary of State's office, in partnership with all of our coalition partners. So we're now in the mindset of how do we make sure that everybody knows that they can vote during the primary in 2026.
Yeah, and if I could just really quick, there is thanks to work that we did in 2023 in the legislative session, that was a big year, honestly, for elections. One of the items that we put in place was a notice to voters prior to each election that there's an election coming. This is how you enter. This is how you can do it. All those things. And so that will be part of sort of the built-in, but certainly we'll be working on communications to voters as well outside of that.
Great. I think we've gotten a little bit of response to our friend Carmen asking a similar question in the chat. So with that, I'm going to jump over to our friend Kathy, who's on the call. Kathy was somebody doing a lot of work with independent voters behind the scenes to support SB 16 this session. So it's great to see you, Kathy. And what's your question?
I mostly wanted to just congratulate everybody. I'm here tonight from Open Primaries and from our project, Let Us Vote. It was a pleasure to add the voices of independent voters across the state. Very glad to hear all the work that's going on now towards the education effort. And I just wanted to share with you all that we are telling the story of your success, the whole 10-year journey, the really brilliant work of creating the winning coalition. I was just on a call before I joined you, speaking with folks in Pennsylvania who are working on a legislative and legal strategy there. And you really, it's a huge win for this movement nationally, and can't thank you all enough. Brilliant leadership. And that's really why I wanted to be here tonight, was to just add that national voice of how much we appreciate and are telling this story everywhere.
Thank you, Kathy. And speaking of national, speaking of what we were able to accomplish, we're only the second state in the nation to pass this through a legislature. And I cannot say this enough times as to like how important what we just all did was, because it wasn't easy and it wouldn't have happened without all the amazing people here on this call and that aren't on this call as well. But the only other state that has done this is Maine, and they did it only a few years ago. So we were just right there tagging along to that success. And, each state has different needs, and this coalition and these sponsors and, everything we did was what this state needed. And so I really think that, it's a historic moment for New Mexico, but also the United States. And it's extra important in a time where voting rights are, trying to be stripped away in given circumstances in certain states. So it's extra important what we did to enable more people to participate and not judge them based on their party affiliation or lack thereof. So thank you, Kathy, for noting that.
New Mexico will certainly be a case study for the about 15 states left that have closed primaries of another way that we can do this. So I see Molly answered this question in chat, but I want to elevate this. So Sylvia said, Molly, I know you said you feel that the education work on modernization has been done, but what do you think the outcome would be for a ballot measure for the paid legislature? Molly?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. Sylvia, I appreciate your question. And I am a community organizer, that's where I started in this work. So I think that community education is never done, but I think that we've built the groundwork for it. And through Common Cause's polling, we have found that 65 to 70% of voters, it kind of fluctuates right in there over the past 5 or 6 years, 65 to 70% of voters support paying our legislators. But I think that if and when the resolution would make it through the legislature, we would have to build a huge campaign infrastructure to make sure that voters have the information, have the correct information, that they know which question it is and how to read the question, to make sure, just because sometimes ballot questions can be worded trickily, is that a word? Tricky, to kind of trick the voters. So I think that our coalition has started brainstorming about how we can fund such a large campaign and organizations that we can work with on the national level to help bring in resources to New Mexico when this does make it to the voters. But it's just like, we've got to get it through the hurdle of the legislature first.
Thank you, Molly.
Mhm.
Anyone else care to raise their hand with a question? Oh, we got one. Nathan.
Sure, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Um, I appreciate hearing a little bit about what you guys have done and what's coming next. I was wondering if you could spend a little bit of time talking about why what's coming next is coming next. Like, what's the strategy here? I guess the implication or the subtle thing I'm thinking about is why not go after ranked choice voting if you've had headwinds against paying the legislature and it's failed, what did you say, 6 times? Like, why do this next? What's the grand strategy? How does this all fit in?
I guess I can only speak for New Mexico open elections, but what brings us all here together is what, like, the desire for a more representative and participatory democratic process. And this was just, one little piece of the puzzle. And when I pitched this to legislators, I never said this is the solution for making elections representative and um, democratic, but it's a piece of a bigger puzzle, such as bills that Representative Rubio and Molly are working on, salaries. Having salaries is so crucial to making our elected officials more representative of New Mexico because 99% of people can't run for office that live here because they can't afford to. And there's so many people that are like, oh, I'm going to run for office. And then they do get elected, and then they don't realize they don't get paid until after they get elected. And so we need to fix that problem so that we have healthier options on the ballot when we go to vote, and so that more people can exercise their right to vote without having to go through these added loopholes. Um, our organization loves ranked choice voting. We have introduced it statewide before. It always dies in its first committee. Our state and our elected officials are just not ready for anything like that anytime soon. And so our and Common Cause's small baby strategy right now is to work on getting Albuquerque to adopt ranked choice voting. And we think that once we get that done, then three major cities in our state would be using ranked choice for their municipal elections. And then it'll be an easier sell to convince legislators that this is good and that people are, used to using it, etc. We know that the Democratic Party uses it for their internal elections. And so if we can just put ranked choice in front of more people, if you ever see Common Cause tabling anywhere, they'll always have like a little sample ballot where you can rank choice your favorite taco flavor or whatever. And so like it's a great excuse to get people to accustom themselves, I guess, to seeing a ballot like that and like testing out what that system looks like and stuff like that. So definitely there's appetite, but not from the legislators themselves yet, at least not a majority of them, because again, it always dies in its first committee. But there's so many issues that are parts of the puzzle that we are all working on. It's just so time consuming because on average it takes a bill 10 years to pass, and we literally saw it happen this session as it's been the 10th year that open primaries was introduced and it finally passed. So and then there's always the consideration of it. Is the governor going to sign it or is it a ballot initiative and are the voters going to vote for it? So there's so many like systemic barriers to what we're all trying to do. And it definitely does not happen overnight.
Yeah, thank you, Sila, and thanks for that question, Nathan. That is something that my team and I are trying to figure out now. Like what comes next, especially with what's happening at the federal level and the uncertainty and all of the attacks on elections and voting protections at the federal level. Like, how can we make sure that New Mexico continues to be a safe place for democracy and elections? That's part of the reason that two of our priority bills that we were working on this year. So Lindsey mentioned the campaign finance bill that would have closed some loopholes and some gaps in our campaign finance and reporting laws, just because we're seeing unprecedented, I hate that term as an elder millennial. We're living through unprecedented times, I know, but unprecedented amounts of money coming into elections from out of state, from out of the country. And so we want to make sure that New Mexico state laws are as tight as possible. So that was a really disappointing uh, death of a bill this session. The other piece was a lobbying reform bill. So lobbyists in New Mexico have a lot of power, and part of that is because we have an unpaid legislature, I think, and because we had an unstaffed legislature for so long. Our legislators deal with 1,000 bills every year at least, and they don't have the capacity to know the nuances of every single bill. And so I believe that lobbyists have a lot of power because legislators do rely on the lobbyists in the roundhouse for information. And so what this bill that we were trying to pass this session, which did pass the legislature and ultimately was vetoed by the governor, was just to increase transparency around the lobbyists in the roundhouse, talking to our legislators. Who do they work for? Who is funding them? What bills are they working on? Do they support? Do they oppose them? And so just trying to increase transparency and increase trust of what's going on during the legislative session. So those were some of the things that we were working on here in New Mexico. Because New Mexico, Lindsey said it, we're #1 in election administration. Like we have been doing the groundwork for democracy issues here in the state. And so that's one thing that my team and I is always trying to consider is like, what else can we do to strengthen and defend our democracy on the state level when there's so much chaos happening at the federal level?
As the time's running out, if maybe I could slow pitch one. You all have mentioned capacity resource constraints, like how do we get involved? What's the volunteer structure? I don't know. I've had a few conversations. There's a lot of education material, other than calling my legislature or writing a letter. What's happening?
It's like you were ready to transition us to the end of the call. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, to kind of wrap up the conversation today, our success, especially with SB 16 this year, is the result of years-long momentum. And that momentum is the coalition of more organizations, the community organizing of more people all working together on these issues. And I think that we're all optimistic that we can continue to build on that momentum to these other issues and policies that we'd like to see addressed in the state. You know, one issue that we didn't talk at all about today is independent redistricting, and that is becoming more and more timely as the next census, hopefully, is coming closer and closer, right? So my kind of optimistic outlook is that we're all here in this room and we're all committed to this work and are going to keep taking these baby steps to bring these strategies together and have one success after another, although obviously we continue to have some setbacks too, because this is politics that we're working in and it's a polarized time, right? So for that, I just want to thank everyone so much for being here today. I want to invite everyone to stay involved. You can follow New Mexico Open Elections or Common Cause New Mexico if you follow us on social media, or go to our website. You can sign up to become a volunteer, to be a supporter. So much of our organization is donor powered. So becoming a donor today really helps us fulfill our mission as well and will lead to more successes. You know, we have this big open primaries rollout coming. So please know that the SOS website, your local clerks are going to have updated information on their websites as we get closer to this first semi-open primary. And we are just so thankful to all of you today for joining us, for participating and doing your civic duty in our democracy, joining a community of like-minded people. This is what it takes. So thank you so much, everyone. We are just really appreciative of your time tonight.